I want you to imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your babies, your own flesh and blood, had already been promised to strangers. Not taken by the state. Not removed by a court order. Promised. Quietly. Deliberately. By the one person on earth who was supposed to love them as much as you did. I want you to imagine sitting in a lawyer's office, shaking so hard you can't hold the paper in your hands, reading a document with your name on it, a signature that looks exactly like yours, authorizing the voluntary relinquishment of your parental rights to twin girls, 6 weeks old. I want you to imagine realizing, in that moment, that your ex-husband had not just left you. He had tried to erase you. This is my story. And I need you to hear all of it, because what happened next is the reason I am still standing. My name is Rebecca Callahan. I am 38 years old. I live in Dallas, Texas, in a yellow house on a quiet street in the Oak Cliff neighborhood, with a backyard that has a tire swing and a vegetable garden that I am still, after 3 years, trying to keep alive with mixed results. I have twin daughters named Ava and Emma. They are 4 years old. They have their father's dark hair and my stubborn streak and an absolutely ironclad conviction that bedtime is a suggestion rather than a rule. They are the most important thing that has ever happened to me. And there was a period of 11 weeks that I will never fully recover from. Not completely. Not in the way people mean when they say the word recover, like it means going back to who you were. When I did not know if I was going to be allowed to keep them. I am going to tell you everything. I am going to tell you about the man I married, and what he did, and how he thought he was going to get away with it. I am going to tell you about the lawyers and the judges and the social workers and the one investigator who looked at a document and said, quietly, "This doesn't look right to me," and how those 6 words changed the entire direction of my life. But first I need to take you back to the beginning. Because none of this makes sense without the beginning. I grew up in Fort Worth, Texas. My father was a retired Army veteran who worked as a logistics coordinator for a freight company after he left the military. My mother was a dental hygienist. We were a practical family, not cold, but organized. Feelings were acknowledged and then set aside in favor of problem solving. My father used to say, "You can cry about it or you can fix it, but you can't do both at the same time." I spent most of my childhood trying to figure out how to do both at the same time. I have not entirely stopped trying. I went to the University of Texas at Arlington on a partial academic scholarship. I studied accounting. I was not passionate about accounting the way some people are passionate about their work. I did not dream about spreadsheets or wake up excited about tax code, but I was good at it. And being good at something felt like enough of a reason to pursue it when you are 19 years old and trying to make practical decisions about your future. I graduated in 2008, right in the middle of the financial crisis, which is an excellent time to graduate with an accounting degree if your goal is to spend 6 months sending out resumes and hearing nothing back. I eventually found a position at a mid-sized accounting firm in Dallas. I rented a small apartment in Uptown with a roommate named Priya who is still one of my closest friends. I built a life that was small and manageable and entirely mine. I met Brandon Callahan in 2011. He was 32. I was 26. He worked in commercial real estate, not as an agent, but on the development side, which he explained to me in great detail at the birthday party where we met. And which I pretended to find more interesting than I did, because he was charming and good-looking, and he laughed at my jokes in a way that made me feel like the funniest person in the room. We dated for 2 years. He was attentive and generous, and he had a way of making ordinary things feel special. He would show up at my apartment with takeout from a restaurant I had mentioned once, 3 weeks earlier, that I wanted to try. He remembered things. He paid attention. At 26, 27, 28, I interpreted this as devotion. I understand now that there is a version of paying attention that is about love, and a version that is about control. At the time, I could not tell the difference. We got engaged in 2013. We got married in 2014 in a small ceremony at a ranch outside of Fort Worth. My parents, his parents, our closest friends, late October. The kind of Texas evening where the temperature finally drops below 90 degrees and everything smells like cedar and dry grass. I thought I was happy. I want to be precise about that. I wasn't performing happiness. I genuinely believed that what I had was what I wanted. Looking back now, I can see the things I explained away. The way he would go quiet and cold if I made plans without consulting him first. The way he kept track of our finances in a separate account that I had limited visibility into, which he explained as efficiency, and which I accepted as efficiency. The way he had opinions about my friendships, not loud opinions, not controlling ones, just small persistent observations about which of my friends were drama or a bad influence until, slowly, my circle narrowed without me quite noticing it was narrowing. But I am not here to diagnose my marriage. I am here to tell you what happened. In the spring of 2019, I found out I was pregnant. And then, 6 weeks after that, I found out it was twins. Brandon's reaction was not what I expected. I had expected excitement. I had expected the kind of stunned joy that I had seen on the faces of other people when they received this kind of news. Disbelief softening into happiness, softening into the beginning of a new identity. What I got was silence. Not the short silence of someone absorbing information. A long, careful silence. The kind that has something behind it. He said, "Are you sure?" I said. The doctor confirmed it. 2 heartbeats. They're both strong. He nodded slowly. He said, "Okay." And then he got up and went to the garage where he spent the next 2 hours doing something I couldn't see. And when he came back inside, he was smiling the right kind of smile. The one I was used to, and he said, "Well, guess we need a bigger house." And I told myself that was normal. I told myself that men process things differently. I told myself the silence had been shock, and the retreat had been processing, and the smile was the real thing. I was wrong about all of it. The pregnancy was difficult. I had hyperemesis gravidarum in the first trimester, which is a clinical way of saying I was violently ill for 12 weeks in a way that required 4 fluids twice, and cost me 8 pounds I did not have to lose. I went on modified bed rest at 24 weeks, because my blood pressure was doing things my OB did not like. I stopped working from the office at 26 weeks and worked remotely, which my firm accommodated, for which I was grateful. Brandon was present during this time. I want to be fair about that. He drove me to appointments. He brought me food I could actually keep down, plain crackers, ginger tea, the specific brand of sparkling water that somehow helped. He sat in the waiting room during the ultrasounds and asked the right questions. But there was something underneath it. A restlessness. A quality of endurance rather than devotion. Like someone fulfilling an obligation rather than choosing to be there. I noticed it. I told myself I was being paranoid. Pregnancy does things to your perception. You are exhausted and uncomfortable, and your emotions are not entirely your own. I gave him the benefit of every doubt I had. Ava Michelle Callahan and Emma Grace Callahan were born on November 3, 2019. They were 5 weeks early. Ava came first, 3 pounds 14 ounces, screaming immediately, a thin, reedy, furious sound that was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. Emma came 4 minutes later, 3 pounds 9 ounces, quieter, blinking at the lights like she was already taking inventory of the situation. They spent 17 days in the NICU. I spent 17 days sleeping in a chair beside their isolettes, leaving only when the nurses made me. Eating vending machine food and calling my mother twice a day, and watching the monitors with the focused attention of someone who has decided that if she just watches hard enough, nothing bad will happen. Brandon visited. Not every day. He had work, he said. Things to manage. I understood, I said. When they came home, both of them, finally, on the same day, a Tuesday in late November, I sat in the back seat of the car with one hand on each of their carriers and did not say a single word the entire drive home. I just watched them breathe. In and out. In and out. We were home. We were all home. I thought the hard part was over. It wasn't. The first 6 weeks after bringing the girls home were the hardest of my life. Harder than the pregnancy. Harder than the NICU. Harder than anything I had experienced up to that point. Twin newborns do not sleep on the same schedule unless you work very hard to make them sleep on the same schedule. And even then the schedule is more of a suggestion than a contract. I was breastfeeding, which meant that every 2 to 3 hours, day and night, I was needed in a specific physical way that no one else could provide. I was recovering from a cesarean section. I was running on fragments of sleep stitched together like a quilt with too many holes. My mother came for the first 2 weeks. She was practical and efficient, and she did laundry and cooked food and held babies so I could shower. And when she left I cried for an hour, and then told myself I was fine. Brandon did not take paternity leave. His company offered 2 weeks, he took 3 days. I did not fight him on it. I should have. But I was too tired to fight anything, and there was a part of me that had already begun to understand, without fully letting myself understand it, that fighting Brandon required more energy than I currently had access to. He came home every evening. He held the babies when I asked him to. He responded to requests, "Get me water. Can you take Emma for 20 minutes? I need to sleep." But he did not anticipate. He did not offer. He waited to be told what was needed, and then did it with the energy of someone completing a task on a list rather than someone who wanted to be there. I was drowning. And he was standing on the shore, technically present, technically helping, but not actually reaching for me. In January of 2020, 6 weeks after the girls came home, I told him I needed more help. He said he was doing everything he could. I said I didn't think that was true. He got very quiet. And then he said something that I have thought about every single day since. He said, "I don't know if I can do this, Rebecca." I said, "Do what?" He looked at the girls, Ava in the bouncer, Emma in my arms, and he said, "This." I stared at him. He said, "I didn't sign up for this. This isn't what I thought it was going to be." I said, "They're 6 weeks old, Brandon. They're premature. This is temporary." He said, "Is it?" And then he went to bed. He left on a Friday in February. Not the way Greg left Sarah Mitchell, not with a text message. Brandon left with a suitcase at 2 in the afternoon, while I was nursing Emma in the living room and Ava was asleep in the bassinet beside me. He stood in the doorway with the suitcase at his feet, and he said he was going to stay with a friend. He said he needed space. He said he wasn't ending the marriage, just taking a break, and that we could talk when things settled down. I looked at him over Emma's head. I said, "If you walk out that door right now, you need to understand what you're walking out on." He picked up the suitcase. He said, "I'll call you." He didn't call. Not that day. Not that week. Not for 3 weeks, during which I managed 2 premature infants alone, went back to working remotely because my maternity leave had run out, and began the slow and humiliating process of understanding that the person I had built my life with had simply decided he didn't want it anymore. When he finally called, it was not to apologize. It was to tell me he had spoken to a lawyer. The divorce proceedings began in March of 2020, which, as many of you will remember, was also the month that the entire world shut down due to a global pandemic, which added a specific layer of surreal difficulty to the process of dismantling a marriage while caring for 2 3-month-old infants alone in a house I could not afford on my own. I found a lawyer, a family attorney named Patricia Nguyen, who had been recommended by Priya, and who turned out to be one of the most important people in my life, though I didn't know it yet. I scraped together her retainer from savings I had set aside for a home renovation that was not going to happen now. The early negotiations were civil, in the cold, careful way that things between lawyers are civil. Brandon was asking for a 50-50 custody arrangement. I was asking for primary custody with generous visitation, on the grounds that I was the primary caregiver and had been since the girls were born. We were both being reasonable. We were both being strategic. I thought the worst thing that was going to happen was a custody dispute. I was not even close to right. In April of 2020, Patricia called me. I was in the kitchen, both girls finally asleep at the same time, eating cereal standing up, because sitting down felt like a luxury I hadn't earned yet. Patricia said, "Rebecca, I need you to come in as soon as you can arrange childcare. There's something I need to show you in person." I said, "What is it?" She said, "I'd rather show you than tell you. But I need you to stay calm when you see it." I arranged for my neighbor Mrs. Okafor, a retired teacher who had appointed herself honorary grandmother to the girls from the day they came home, to sit with them for 2 hours. I drove to Patricia's office in Uptown Dallas. She slid a document across the desk. It was a voluntary relinquishment of parental rights form. It had my name on it. It had my signature on it. It was dated February 28, 2020, 10 days after Brandon left. It authorized the voluntary termination of my parental rights to Ava Michelle Callahan and Emma Grace Callahan. It named a private adoption agency called Lone Star Family Connections as the receiving party. I picked it up. I put it down. I picked it up again. I said, "I didn't sign this." Patricia said, "I know." I said, "I have never seen this document before in my life." She said, "I know, Rebecca. I believe you." I said, "He was going to give them away." She said, carefully and quietly, "That appears to be what the evidence suggests." I sat in that chair for a very long time. And then I said, "What do we do?" Patricia leaned forward. She said, "We fight." When I walked out of Patricia's office that afternoon, I sat in my car for 20 minutes before I could make myself drive. I had 2 daughters at home who needed me. And I had just discovered that the man who was supposed to love them had tried to make them disappear. This is part 2. I want to tell you what forgery feels like when it is directed at you personally. It does not feel like a crime at first. It feels like a violation of something deeper than law, something that does not have a clean legal word attached to it. It feels like someone reached into the most private version of yourself, the version that exists in your handwriting and your signature and the documents that carry your name, and they put on your face and used it to do something you never would have done. I had signed that document, according to the paper. I had voluntarily agreed to give up my daughters, according to the paper. I had decided, apparently 10 days after my husband left me alone with 2 premature infants, that I did not want them either. That was what the paper said. And somewhere out there, at a private adoption agency called Lone Star Family Connections, in a file with my forged name on it, there were people who believed it. I drove home. Mrs. Okafor was in the living room with Ava on her lap and Emma doing what Emma did at 3 months old, which was stare at the ceiling fan with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing it for future reference. Mrs. Okafor looked at my face when I walked in and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You look like you need to sit down." I said, "I'm fine." She said, "Rebecca, sit down." I sat down. She put Ava in my arms. And something about the weight of her, 3 pounds 14 ounces at birth, now a solid, warm, indignant 7 pounds. Something about holding her in that moment made the reality of what I had just seen in Patricia's office land in my body in a way it hadn't yet. He had tried to give them away. He had forged my name. He had contacted an adoption agency, found one, called them, made appointments, submitted paperwork, while I was home alone feeding our daughters every 2 hours and trying to survive. He had done all of that, quietly and deliberately, and then showed up to divorce negotiations acting like a reasonable man who simply needed space. Ava grabbed my finger. She did this thing she had recently discovered. She would grab your finger, and then look at you, very seriously, as if to confirm that you understood the significance of what had just occurred. I looked at her. I said, very quietly, so Mrs. Okafor wouldn't hear, "I've got you. I promise. I've got you." Patricia moved fast. The morning after our meeting, she filed an emergency motion contesting the validity of the relinquishment document and requesting an immediate freeze on any adoption proceedings related to Ava and Emma Callahan. She contacted the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services. She contacted Lone Star Family Connections directly, putting them on notice that the document they had received was being disputed, and that any action taken on the basis of it would be subject to legal challenge. She also called a forensic document examiner, named Howard Briggs. Howard Briggs was 61 years old, semi-retired, and had spent 30 years as a questioned document examiner, first for the FBI, then as an independent consultant. Patricia had worked with him before. She described him as methodical, meticulous, and absolutely devastating on a witness stand. He came to her office 2 days later with a magnifying loupe and a portable UV light, and spent 90 minutes with the document. I was not there for that meeting. I was home with the girls. Patricia called me that evening. She said, "Howard says it's a forgery. He's confident." I said, "How confident?" She said, "He used the word unambiguous. He found 3 separate inconsistencies in the signature alone: pen pressure, letter formation, and the angle of the terminal stroke on the N in your last name. He also identified evidence of tracing. Someone used your actual signature from another document as a template." I sat down on the kitchen floor. Not dramatically. Just because my legs decided they were done. I said, "Can he prove it in court?" She said, "That's exactly what he's going to do." The question of where Brandon had obtained a copy of my signature was answered 11 days later, when Patricia's investigator, a former Dallas PD detective named Carl Whitmore, who now ran a small private investigation firm, traced the template signature to a document I had signed in 2018. It was a joint financial disclosure form. We had both signed it during a meeting with a financial advisor. The kind of routine document you sign when you are married and trying to be responsible about retirement planning, and neither of you is thinking about what might happen if the marriage falls apart and one of you turns out to be a person who is capable of forging the other's name on a parental relinquishment form. Brandon had kept a copy. He had used it to trace my signature. He had done it carefully enough that it looked, at a glance, like the real thing. But Howard Briggs did not work at a glance. Howard Briggs worked at the level of ink and pressure, and the specific way a particular human hand moves through space, and at that level, nothing about that signature was mine. Carl Whitmore's investigation uncovered other things. Things that made the forgery make more sense, in the terrible way that evidence sometimes makes terrible things make sense. Brandon, it turned out, had not simply been struggling with the reality of fatherhood. Brandon had been planning. Carl found financial records, through legal discovery, through subpoenas that Patricia pushed hard to obtain, that told a story I had not known I was living inside. Brandon had a second bank account. He had opened it 8 months before the girls were born, in March of 2019, 2 months before I found out I was pregnant, which meant either extraordinary coincidence or extraordinary premeditation. And Carl did not believe in extraordinary coincidence. Into this account, over the course of the next 18 months, Brandon had been moving money. Not large amounts at once, nothing that would have triggered automatic flags. Small transfers, irregular intervals, the kind of pattern that looks like normal account maintenance if you are not looking for it, and looks like deliberate concealment if you are. By February of 2020, the month he left, the month he forged my signature, the account contained $147,000. He had also, Carl discovered, been in contact with Lone Star Family Connections since October of 2019. 1 month before the girls were born. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 1 month before his daughters were born, Brandon Callahan contacted a private adoption agency. He attended, according to agency records obtained through subpoena, 2 consultations. He represented himself as a married father expecting twins whose wife was emotionally unstable and unlikely to be capable of caring for the children long term. He asked about the process for voluntary relinquishment. He asked about timelines. He asked, specifically, whether both parents needed to consent. The agency representative, a woman named Donna Marsh, who would later cooperate fully with investigators and who I do not blame, because she was given false information by a man who was practiced at presenting false information convincingly, told him that yes, both parents needed to consent, and that the process required original signatures on specific forms. He thanked her. He went home. He waited for the girls to be born, spent 6 weeks establishing a paper trail of minimal but present involvement, and then left. And then he forged my name. The plan, as Carl reconstructed it, was this. Brandon would leave the marriage, produce a forged relinquishment form with my signature, place the girls for adoption through a private agency, which, unlike state adoption, can involve significant fees paid to birth parents in some arrangements, collect whatever financial consideration was involved, and disappear into the life he had been quietly building with his hidden account and his exit strategy. The girls would be gone. I would have no legal standing to object, because on paper I had already consented. And Brandon would be free. When Carl laid all of this out for me in Patricia's conference room, I did not cry. I had cried already, in the car, in the shower, in the specific exhausted way you cry at 3 in the morning when you are feeding a baby, and the weight of what you are dealing with becomes too heavy to carry in silence. I had done my crying in private, in fragments, between feedings and work calls and the relentless ordinary demands of keeping 2 small people alive. In that conference room, I did not cry. I listened. I asked questions. I said, "Is this enough to press criminal charges?" Patricia said, "The DA's office is already looking at it. Document forgery is a felony in Texas. The financial piece, the hidden account, the potential adoption fees, that opens up additional exposure. Fraud. Possibly wire fraud if any of the communications crossed state lines." I said, "What about Lone Star? Did they know the document was forged?" Patricia said, "That's still being investigated. The current evidence suggests Donna Marsh and the agency acted in good faith on the information they were given. But there are questions about due diligence, specifically about whether they took adequate steps to verify your consent independently." I said, "What happens to the girls while all of this is being investigated?" Patricia said, "They stay with you. The freeze on adoption proceedings is in place. Brandon's parental rights are currently under review pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. You are their mother, Rebecca. Nobody is taking them anywhere." I nodded. I said, "Okay." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "Are you all right?" I thought about the question. I said, "I will be. When this is over, I will be." Brandon was arrested on a Thursday morning in June of 2020. 2 Dallas PD detectives went to the apartment he had been renting in Uptown, a nice apartment, I found out later, significantly nicer than anything our joint finances during the marriage had suggested he could afford, which told its own story about the hidden account and how long it had been accumulating, and arrested him on charges of document forgery, fraud, and child endangerment. I found out from Patricia, who called me at 8:15 in the morning. I was in the kitchen making coffee. Emma was in the bouncer on the counter beside me. She liked to be at eye level, liked to be included in whatever was happening, a quality she has maintained to this day. Ava was in the living room in the play mat, doing what she did every morning, which was conduct what appeared to be a very serious conversation with a stuffed elephant named Gerald. Patricia said, "He's been arrested. I wanted you to hear it from me." I said, "Okay." She said, "Rebecca," I said, "I know." "Thank you, Patricia. I'll call you later." I put the phone down. I looked at Emma. She looked at me. I said, "It's okay, baby. We're going to be okay." She blew a bubble, which I chose to interpret as agreement. The weeks that followed were not simple. I want to be honest about that, because I think there is a version of this story that would skip from the arrest to the resolution and make it sound like once the truth was known, everything fell neatly into place. That is not what happened. What happened was depositions, hearings, document reviews, phone calls with Patricia at odd hours, requests for records from my employer to verify my work history and income, a home visit from a DFPS caseworker named Angela Torres who came to assess the girls' living situation, and who sat in my kitchen for 90 minutes asking careful questions while Ava attempted to give her Gerald the elephant and Emma fell asleep on her shoulder. What happened was, nights when I lay awake doing the math on my finances and wondering how long I could sustain the legal fees, even with the payment plan Patricia had extended me. What happened was, a morning in July when I got a piece of mail from Lone Star Family Connections, a formal letter, on agency letterhead, informing me that they had become aware that the relinquishment document submitted on my behalf had been submitted fraudulently, that they had cooperated fully with law enforcement, and that they were deeply sorry for any distress the situation had caused me. I read that letter 3 times. Then I filed it in the folder marked evidence, because Patricia had told me to keep everything, and I made myself a cup of tea, and I sat at the kitchen table while the girls napped, and I allowed myself, for the first time in months, to feel something other than fight mode survival instinct. I felt something that was almost, cautiously, beginning to resemble hope. My mother came to stay in August. She drove up from Fort Worth with her car packed with casseroles and an air of calm, practical determination that I had grown up taking for granted and now understood, for the first time, was one of the rarest and most valuable things a person can offer someone who is in the middle of falling apart. She did not say much about Brandon. My mother is not a person who wastes words on people who have already revealed exactly who they are. She said, once, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, watching Ava and Emma on the play mat, "He underestimated you." I said, "He did." She said, "That was his first mistake." She stayed for 3 weeks. When she left, I stood at the door watching her car pull away, and I felt the specific loneliness of being a person who has to handle things alone, and then I felt, underneath it, something steadier. Something that had been building quietly all these months while I filed documents and answered questions and kept the girls fed and loved and unaware of the war being fought on their behalf. I was still here. He had tried to erase me, and I was still here. In September of 2020, Brandon Callahan entered a plea negotiation. His attorney contacted Patricia. The offer was this: Brandon would plead guilty to document forgery and 1 count of fraud. In exchange, the child endangerment charge would be reduced. He would serve 18 months, with possibility of early release. He would permanently relinquish all parental rights to Ava and Emma. He would pay restitution. Patricia presented it to me. She said, "It's a reasonable offer. It avoids a trial, which means the girls are never part of a public proceeding. The relinquishment is permanent and irrevocable. He would have no legal claim to them ever again." I said, "What do you think?" She said, "I think you've been through enough. I think a trial would take another year minimum. I think the outcome would likely be similar. And I think there is something to be said for certainty, for knowing, on a specific day, that it is over." I sat with that for a long time. Then I said, "If he pleads guilty, it's on the record. Permanently." She said, "Yes." I said, "Everyone will know what he did." She said, "Yes." I said, "Then yes." The plea hearing was scheduled for October 14, 2020. I know that date the way I know the girls' birthdays and the day Brandon left and the day Patricia slid that document across her desk. There are dates that mark the before and after of your life, the coordinates of the moments that divided everything into what was and what came next. October 14th was one of those dates. I spent the night before doing what I had spent most of the previous 8 months doing, taking care of my daughters and preparing myself for what came next. Mrs. Okafor had agreed to stay with the girls for the day. She arrived at 7 in the morning with a container of jollof rice for my refrigerator and the calm, steady energy of a woman who has lived long enough to understand that some days simply require showing up and doing what needs to be done. I had laid out my clothes the night before. A dark blazer, a white blouse, slacks, sensible heels. The kind of outfit that says, I am a person who takes this seriously, who has taken every part of this seriously, who has not had the luxury of not taking this seriously for a single day in the past 8 months. I stood in the bathroom mirror at 6:30 in the morning and looked at myself for a long moment. I had aged. Not dramatically, not the way people age in movies, where grief carves itself visibly into faces. But there was something different in my eyes. A steadiness that had not been there before. The particular quality of a person who has been tested in ways they did not choose and has not broken. I said, to my reflection, quietly, today it ends. Then I finished getting ready and went to feed my daughters breakfast. Ava ate her oatmeal with focused enthusiasm, and then spent several minutes trying to feed some of it to Gerald the elephant, who remained, as always, politely uninterested. Emma ate approximately half of hers and spent the other half of the time observing me with the particular attention she had always had, this quality of watchfulness, of taking careful inventory of the people around her. She had had it since the NICU. The nurses used to comment on it. This one's going to be trouble, one of them had said, affectionately, watching Emma track movement in the room at 4 days old. She doesn't miss anything. She did not miss anything that morning either. She looked at me, oatmeal spoon paused in midair, and said, in the particular language of an 11-month-old that is mostly sound and emphasis and very little recognizable word, something that I interpreted, perhaps fancifully, as, I see you. You're okay. I kissed the top of her head. I said, I know, baby. I know. Patricia met me outside the courthouse at 8:45. She was in a dark suit, her black hair pulled back, a leather briefcase in one hand and a coffee in the other. She had been doing this for 18 years. She had the quality of composure that comes not from never feeling afraid, but from having learned, over a long time, that fear is simply information, and not a reason to stop moving. She handed me a coffee. She said, How are you doing? I said, I'm ready. She studied me for a moment. She said, You know you don't have to say anything today. The plea is his. This is his hearing, his admission, his record. You just have to be present. I said, I know. She said, But you want to say something. It was not a question. I said, Patricia. He tried to sell my daughters. She nodded once. She said, Then let's go in. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected. I don't know what I had imagined, something larger, perhaps, more proportional to the magnitude of what had happened. But courtrooms are working spaces, not ceremonial ones, and this one was functional and fluorescent lit, and smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, and the specific institutional neutrality of a place where difficult things happen routinely. There were rows of benches behind the bar. My mother was there. She had driven up from Fort Worth the night before, and stayed at my apartment, sleeping in the girls' room on the air mattress she had brought without being asked. Priya was there. Patricia's paralegal, a young woman named Simone who had spent months organizing the documents in this case, with a precision that I was deeply grateful for, was there. Brandon was already at the defense table when I came in. I had not seen him since February. 8 months. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, he was the same height, the same build. But there was something contracted about him. Something that had been, not confident exactly, but assured. A particular kind of assurance that comes from being the person in the room who believes they are the smartest and most capable. That was simply gone. He did not look at me when I came in. I sat down. I looked at him steadily and without expression, because I had decided, sometime in the middle of one of those 3 a.m. feedings, that I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. Not here. Not today. He did not turn around. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Sandra Okafor. Not Mrs. Okafor from next door, a different Okafor entirely, a coincidence that struck me as the universe's idea of a small, private joke. Judge Sandra Okafor was 54 years old, had been on the bench for 11 years, and had a reputation, Patricia had told me, for being precise, fair and entirely unwilling to have her time wasted. She entered the courtroom and everyone rose and then sat, and she arranged her papers and looked out at the room with the particular attention of someone who has learned to read a courtroom the way other people read a page. She said, "We are here today for the plea hearing in the matter of the state of Texas versus Brandon Michael Callahan. Mr. Callahan, you are charged with document forgery in the 1st degree, fraud, and child endangerment. It is my understanding that you have reached a plea agreement with the state. Is that correct?" Brandon's attorney said, "That is correct, Your Honor." She said, "Mr. Callahan, I am going to need to hear from you directly. Do you understand the charges against you?" Brandon said, in a voice that was quieter than I had ever heard from him, "Yes, Your Honor." She said, "Do you understand that by entering this plea, you are waiving your right to a trial, your right to confront witnesses against you, and your right to present a defense?" He said, "Yes, Your Honor." She said, "And how do you plead?" A pause. The pause lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It felt considerably longer. Brandon Callahan said, "Guilty, Your Honor." I had thought about this moment many times. During the night feedings, in the shower, during the long drives to Patricia's office. I had imagined what it would feel like to hear him say that word in a courtroom, on the record, in front of a judge and my mother and the fluorescent lights and the old paper smell. I had thought it would feel like triumph. It did not feel like triumph. It felt like release. Like something that had been pulled tight for 8 months, a wire inside my chest, thin and taut and vibrating, finally, quietly, went slack. Not triumph. Just the end of holding on so hard. The DA's office presented the terms of the plea agreement. Guilty plea on document forgery in the 1st degree. Guilty plea on fraud. The child endangerment charge reduced to a lesser offense in exchange for the cooperation Brandon had provided regarding the financial records. 18 months in county, with eligibility for early release at 12. Restitution to be determined. Permanent, irrevocable relinquishment of parental rights to Ava Michelle Callahan and Emma Grace Callahan. Judge Okafor listened to all of it. Then she said, "Before I accept this agreement, I have some questions for the record." She looked at the documents in front of her. She said, "Mr. Callahan, you contacted the adoption agency in question in October of 2019. Is that correct?" His attorney leaned in. Brandon said, "Yes, Your Honor." She said, "Your daughters were born in November of 2019. He said, "Yes." She said, "You contacted this agency before they were born." It was not a question. She let it sit in the room. Then she said, "You forged your wife's signature on a legal document authorizing the termination of her parental rights." He said, "Yes, Your Honor." She said, "You did this while she was home caring for your premature infant daughters." Another pause. He said, "Yes." Judge Okafor looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I want to make certain the record is absolutely clear on what occurred here. This was not an impulsive act. This was not a decision made in crisis. This was a deliberate, premeditated scheme to fraudulently terminate the parental rights of a mother to her newborn children. The planning began before those children were even born. Is there anything you would like to say for the record before I proceed?" Brandon's attorney leaned in again. Brandon said, "No, Your Honor." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she looked at me. She said, "Ms. Callahan, I understand you have prepared a statement. You may approach. I had written and rewritten that statement 11 times. The first version was 8 pages long and contained every single thing I had felt and thought and survived in the past 8 months. Patricia had gently suggested that perhaps 8 pages was more than the moment required. I had written it down to 4 pages, then 3, then 1. Then I had thrown all of it away and started again. The final version was 1 page. Handwritten. Because I had decided that if I was going to stand in front of a judge and speak the truth of what had happened to me and my daughters, it was going to be in my own handwriting, in my own words, without the mediation of a word processor. I walked to the podium. I placed the paper on the surface in front of me. I did not look at Brandon. I looked at Judge Okafor. And I spoke. Your Honor. I am Rebecca Callahan. I am the mother of Ava and Emma Callahan, who are 11 months old today. I am standing here because a man who was supposed to be their father decided, before they were even born, that they were inconvenient. That they did not fit into the life he wanted. That the simplest solution was to make them and me disappear. He did not make us disappear. I want to speak directly about what the past 8 months have been. I have worked full-time while managing a legal case that has cost me more money than I can comfortably afford. I have cared for 2 premature infants alone. I have answered questions from caseworkers and investigators and attorneys, while simultaneously making sure that my daughters did not feel, in any moment, on any day, that their world was anything other than safe and stable and full of love. I have not always slept. I have not always been okay. There have been nights when I sat on the kitchen floor after the girls were asleep, and I let myself feel the full weight of what had been done to me, because I could not afford to feel it during the day. But I got up every morning. I got up because they needed me to get up. Because they were counting on me in a way that is so complete and so without condition that it makes every hard thing survivable. What Brandon did was not simply a crime against me. It was a crime against 2 children who had done nothing except be born into a situation they had no control over. He looked at his daughters and saw a problem to be managed. He looked at them and made calculations. I looked at them and saw my whole life. I am not asking for sympathy. I am asking that the record reflect, clearly and permanently, what was done here. Not so that I can feel vindicated, but so that it cannot be minimized. So that the word forgery on a legal document does not obscure what was actually attempted, which was the erasure of a mother and the trafficking of 2 infant children for financial gain. Ava and Emma will grow up knowing they are loved completely. They will grow up knowing that someone fought for them without reservation and without ceasing. They will not grow up knowing their father. That is his loss. It is a loss he chose. I am done now. Thank you, Your Honor. I walked back to my seat. My mother reached forward from the row behind me and put her hand on my shoulder. I put my hand over hers. I did not look at Brandon. Judge Okafor was quiet for a moment after I sat down. Then she said, "Thank you, Ms. Callahan." She looked down at her papers. She said, "The court accepts the plea agreement as presented, with the following additions to the record." She put on her glasses. She said, "The court finds that the conduct in this case was not only criminal, but represented a fundamental betrayal of parental responsibility and a deliberate attempt to circumvent the legal rights of a co-parent. The permanent relinquishment of parental rights to Ava Michelle Callahan and Emma Grace Callahan is hereby entered into the record as irrevocable. Mr. Callahan will have no legal standing with respect to these children from this day forward. In addition to the agreed restitution, the court is adding a requirement of financial support to be determined at a subsequent hearing, to address the costs incurred by Ms. Callahan as a direct result of Mr. Callahan's criminal conduct." She looked up. She said, "Mr. Callahan, you are remanded into custody. Sentencing will proceed as agreed." She looked at me one more time. She said, "Ms. Callahan, take your daughters home." I walked out of that courthouse into a bright October afternoon. The sky was the particular shade of blue that only happens in Texas in October, deep and clear and absolutely enormous. The kind of sky that makes you feel small in a way that is somehow comforting rather than diminishing. My mother was beside me. Priya was on my other side. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then my mother said, "Let's go get your girls." Mrs. Okafor had the girls in the living room when we arrived. Ava was on the floor with her blocks. She had recently discovered that stacking them and then knocking them over was one of the great pleasures available to a person of her age and size, and she was pursuing this discovery with characteristic dedication. Emma was on Mrs. Okafor's lap, doing the thing she always did when she was comfortable and safe, which was lean back against whoever was holding her and observe the room with those steady, watchful eyes. When I came through the door, Emma saw me first. She made a sound, not a word exactly, not yet, but something that was unmistakably directed at me, something that meant, "There you are, I've been keeping track, I knew you'd come back." I crossed the room in 4 steps and picked her up. She grabbed 2 fists full of my blazer and held on. Ava looked up from her blocks. She said, clearly and with great authority, "Mama." It was one of her first real words. She had been practicing it for about 3 weeks, deploying it at various moments with the precision of someone who understood its power and was not yet sure of its full range of application. That afternoon, in that moment, she got it exactly right. I sat down on the floor beside her blocks, Emma still in my arms, and I pulled Ava into my lap, and I held both of them, and I did not say anything at all for a very long time. Mrs. Okafor quietly got up and went to the kitchen. My mother sat on the couch. Priya stood in the doorway. Nobody spoke. There are moments that do not require words. Moments that are complete exactly as they are, without narration or explanation or the mediation of language. This was one of those moments. 2 small girls in their mother's arms on a living room floor in Dallas, Texas, on a bright October afternoon, while the world outside continued doing what it does and inside everything was, finally, still. The weeks after the hearing had their own particular quality. Not easy, I want to be careful about that, because I think there is a temptation, when telling a story like this, to let the resolution of the legal battle stand in for the resolution of everything. To let the courtroom victory be the ending and skip over what comes after. But what comes after is its own kind of work, and I think it deserves to be said. What comes after is, you keep going. You wake up every morning and you make the bottles and you do the laundry and you answer the work emails and you pay the bills and you read the bedtime stories. You go to the pediatrician appointments and you call your mother on Sunday evenings and you have dinner with Priya every other Thursday, because she instituted a standing dinner date sometime in April of that year and simply refused to cancel it regardless of what was happening, which is one of the most loving things another person has ever done for me. You have nights when you wake up at 2 in the morning with your heart pounding and it takes a moment, a long, disoriented moment, to remember that it is over. That the document is off the table. That the adoption agency has been notified. That his parental rights are gone. That the judge said irrevocable and meant it. And then you remember. And you breathe. And you go back to sleep. Brandon began his sentence in November of 2020. I did not follow the details closely. Patricia kept me informed of the necessary legal developments, the sentencing confirmation, the restitution schedule, the subsequent hearing on financial support, and I paid attention to those because they were practical and they affected the girl's future. But I did not track where he was or what his days looked like or whether he was doing well or badly. He had made his choice. I had made mine. Those 2 things did not need to be in relationship with each other anymore. The financial support order came through in January of 2021. It was not a large amount. Brandon's assets, once the hidden account was fully investigated and the restitution payments were factored in, were considerably less impressive than they had appeared. But it was something. It was consistent. It was court-ordered and enforceable, and it represented, in concrete legal terms, the acknowledgement that he had caused harm that had a cost. I put that money directly into a savings account for the girls. I did not touch it. I labeled the account in my phone with 2 words, their future. The girls turned 1 in November of 2020. We had a small party, my mother, Priya, Mrs. Okafor, my colleague from the accounting firm named Deirdre who had covered for me more times than I could count during the hardest months, and who had never once made me feel like it was a burden. We had a cake with 2 candles and the girls wore matching dresses that my mother had bought, and that they both immediately attempted to use as napkins. Ava put both hands directly into her cake. Emma studied hers for a long moment first, then made a single, deliberate, exploratory press with 1 finger, tasted it, and then also put both hands in. I took approximately 40 photographs in 12 minutes. I looked at those photographs that night, after everyone had gone home and the girls were asleep and the apartment was quiet and slightly sticky with cake residue, and I felt something I had not felt in so long that it took me a moment to identify it. Joy. Not relief, which I had felt plenty of. Not the grim satisfaction of having survived, which was its own thing entirely. Not the exhausted gratitude of making it through another day. Joy. Actual, uncomplicated, full-bodied joy. My daughters were 1 year old. They were healthy and happy and completely convinced that birthday cake was one of the foundational pillars of human experience. We had made it. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with my mother that night. She stayed later than she usually did, because she had sensed, with the particular accuracy of a mother who knows her daughter well, that I needed the company. We sat at the kitchen table after the girls were asleep, drinking tea, and for a while we just sat there in the comfortable silence that exists between people who have known each other long enough that silence doesn't need to be filled. Then my mother said, "Do you remember what your father used to say?" I said, "Which thing?" She smiled. "My father had many things he used to say." She said, "You can cry about it, or you can fix it." I said, "I remember." She said, "You did both. At the same time." "I know he said you couldn't, but you did." I looked at her. She said, "I watched you do it. For 8 months I watched you cry and fix simultaneously. And I want you to know, I want you to hear this from me directly. I have never in my life been more proud of anyone than I have been of you this year." I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "I didn't do it alone." She said, "Nobody does anything alone. That's not weakness. That's just the truth." I thought about Patricia and Carl and Howard Briggs and Mrs. Okafor and Priya and Deirdre and Angela Torres the caseworker and Judge Sandra Okafor and the specific, unnamed nurse in the NICU who had held my hand during one of the long nights in November of 2019, when everything felt impossible, and said, quietly, "They're fighters. Both of them. I can see it already." I said, "No. Nobody does anything alone." My mother reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. We finished our tea. Ava and Emma are 4 years old now. Ava is loud and physical and absolutely fearless. She approaches every situation with her whole body and a complete lack of hesitation that delights and terrifies me in equal measure. She is still devoted to Gerald the elephant, though she has expanded her inner circle to include a stuffed dinosaur named Kevin and a small plastic horse, with no name that she simply calls the horse. Emma is quieter and more deliberate. She watches. She considers. She has recently developed a passionate interest in birds, specifically in identifying them, which she does with a focus and accuracy that her pediatrician described as genuinely unusual for a 4-year-old, and which I choose to interpret as evidence of future ornithological greatness. She can identify a house finch from across a yard. I did not know what a house finch was before Emma taught me. They fight with each other the way twins fight, constantly, passionately, and with a complete lack of any lasting grievance. They can be screaming at each other over a toy 1 minute and then asleep in the same position, foreheads touching, 10 minutes later. They are the best thing that has ever happened to me. They are the reason I got up off the floor every single time. I went back to therapy in the spring of 2021. I had gone briefly years before, after a difficult period in my mid-20s that I won't detail here, and I had found it useful, and then stopped when things got better, the way people do. Going back felt like admitting something, though I have spent enough time now in that office to understand that it is not an admission of weakness, but an acknowledgement of reality. What happened to me was significant, and significant things leave marks. And marks deserve attention. My therapist is a woman named Dr. Yolanda Price. She is patient and precise, and she has a way of asking questions that makes you feel like you are discovering something rather than being examined. She has been helping me work through the specific grief of having been betrayed by someone I trusted completely, which is, she has explained to me, its own category of loss, distinct from the loss of the relationship itself. I am still working through it. I expect I will be working through it for a long time. That is okay. Working through something is not the same as being destroyed by it. I want to say something now to every person who is watching this. I want to say it directly, without softening it, because I think the version of this story that gets told most often is the version that focuses on the crime, the forgery, the fraud, the courtroom, the guilty plea. And those things matter. They are real and they are important, and they are part of what happened. But I think the more important story, the one that I actually lived, the one that I want you to take with you, is not about what Brandon did. It is about what I did. I got up every single morning for 8 months, while fighting a legal battle that I had not asked for and could not afford, and that threatened the most fundamental thing in my life. I got up. I made the bottles. I went to work. I answered the emails. I read the documents. I sat in the lawyers' offices and the courtrooms, and I did not fall apart in the places where falling apart would have cost me something I could not afford to lose. I am not telling you this because I am exceptional. I am telling you this because I am not. I am a 38-year-old accountant from Fort Worth, Texas, who made a wrong choice about who to marry and who spent a long time paying the price for that wrong choice. I am someone who has cried on a kitchen floor more times than she would like to admit. I am someone who has lain awake at 3 in the morning doing math that didn't add up and feeling fear that had no bottom to it. I am ordinary. And if I could do this, if I could hold my family together through this specific, targeted, deliberate attempt to take it apart, then I need you to know that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when they have no other choice. You have no other choice. Whatever you are facing right now, whatever the version of this is in your life, whatever the thing is that feels too big and too unfair and too exhausting to survive, you have no other choice but to get up. So get up. Make the bottles. Read the documents. Call the lawyer. Take the help when it's offered. Let your mother sit at your kitchen table and cover your hand with hers and say the things you need to hear. And then get up again tomorrow. Because on the other side of this, I promise you, I am living proof. On the other side of this, there is a living room floor in Dallas, Texas, where 2 little girls are waiting for you to come through the door. And when you do, one of them will grab 2 fists full of your blazer and hold on. And the other one will look up from her blocks and say your name. And it will be worth every single thing it cost. I want to end with something small. Last Tuesday morning I was making breakfast. Oatmeal, the girls' current preference, though Emma has recently begun lobbying for waffles with an intensity that suggests this is not a passing interest. The kitchen was noisy in the way it always is, Ava narrating something at volume, Emma asking focused questions about a bird she had seen through the window, Gerald the elephant presiding over the proceedings from his position on the counter. And I stopped for a moment. Just for a second. Just long enough to take a breath and look at the 2 of them, these 4-year-old people who had arrived in the world 6 weeks early and spent 17 days in the NICU and had, without knowing it, been the reason their mother kept getting up off the floor for 8 of the hardest months of her life. Ava looked up. She said, "Mama." "Oatmeal." Emma said, without looking up from the bird book. she had somehow acquired at 7 in the morning. Please, Ava. We say please. Ava considered this. She said, Mama. Oatmeal. Please. I laughed. I made the oatmeal. And I thought, this exact moment. This noisy, ordinary, imperfect, completely irreplaceable morning. This is what I fought for. This is what I won. If this story moved you, if any part of Rebecca's journey stayed with you, I want to ask you to do something right now. Hit that like button. It takes 1 second and it tells me that these stories matter to you. Leave a comment below. Tell me what part of this story hit you hardest. Tell me if you have been through something like this. Tell me if you know someone who has. This community is built on those conversations, and every single comment means something to me. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. You might not know who that person is until you think about it for a second, but I think you know. Someone who is in the middle of something hard. Someone who needs to be reminded that ordinary people survive extraordinary things every single day. And if you are new here, if this is the first Justice Served Tales story you have ever watched, please subscribe to this channel. Hit the bell so you never miss a story. Every week I bring you real stories about real people who faced impossible situations and refused to give up. Stories about justice. Stories about survival. Stories about the kind of strength that doesn't look like strength from the outside, that looks like getting up one more time, making one more bottle, filing one more document, showing up one more day. Those are the stories I am here to tell. And I am not going anywhere. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next one.